Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Real Podcast. Just a quick disclaimer. If you are sensitive to topics such as obesity and weight management, please click away now as we will be discussing that in the following cast. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the cast. Welcome to the Real Health and Nutrition Podcast, where real talk meets real health. I'm Matthew Rigoni.
My name's Max Dennehy.
We're your dietitian duo ready to have a chat about the crazy world of health and nutrition, sport, and performance. What is our topic for today, Max?
Our topic for today is all about BMI. So I'm mostly going to be focusing on our opinions on BMI, what we think it's useful for, what we like about it, what we don't like about it. Really, really deep dive and summary into BMI. So the goal for today is going to be talking about our opinions, obviously, and our opinion are probably going to be different at some point. And hopefully you, the viewer, can come to your own consensus as to what you like about us and mostly probably what you don't like, to be fair, Matt. Would you agree?
I think it's very easy to point out what we don't like about things and very easy to do so. Absolutely. Please give us a little tiny shred of forgiveness.
So yeah, essentially, hopefully we can come to some sort of a consensus ourselves. But if we don't, that's always going to be your decision. But let's take it away, Matt. Let's get started. BMI. I'm interested to know overall what do you like about it, because I kind of have a summary, which I'm happy to start the summary from the start, to be fair, and then we can kind of work backwards a bit, reverse engineer it if you'd like to.
I don't know, Max. I think a summary would be almost.
It sounds bad because people will just click off after that.
Yeah. I think people like the bit of foreplay. You know, we can't just jump straight to the exciting bit at the end.
That's true.
We'll jump into things from a little systematic kind of perspective. I've got some topics that I want to talk about. Max, do you want to take it through one of your own topics first, or do we want to switch it up and mix it with mine?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, look, we could both start off with some pros and cons. I think before we get into that, let's actually get into generous people's opinions about BMI, especially if you're in the sphere of nutrition. They tend to really not like them. It'd be cool to do a survey with dietitians or nutritionists, especially budding nutritionists, I feel like, because they're the ones who, it's such a cool thing to hate on BMI. Such a hell yeah, I'm radical because I'm
a
BMI.
rebel against this system.
Yeah, bro. So for me, I think the biggest thing is that it's very popular, and the thing I always hear is that it's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. All it tells you is just a single number. It doesn't really tell you anything much more beyond that single number. And there's a bunch of people that don't that are sort of, what's the matter? They're like excused, or they don't abide by the rules of BMI essentially. So then it's useless. And that's kind of the consensus that they'll give you and the arguments they'll give you. And I guess today's podcast will be discussing whether they're true or not, really.
Absolutely. Well put, Max. Well put.
So what's my opinions? My opinions are that I think it's actually quite useful. I think it's a pretty good tool on the whole. So there are obviously everything that's said in those points that are said about your typical nutrition student, that it's not applicable to everyone. They'll say things like it's only made for white men, that it is, what are some other points they'll make? That, someone with a high amount of muscle mass will show up as a high BMI, but they don't necessarily have negative health risks. It only offers you a single number, so it doesn't tell you about the body composition, health status, or anything about that person. They're all absolutely true, but I think they can be more or less debunked pretty quickly once we start having a think about things properly.
That is a very loaded statement. There is an absolute ton to go through in that entire little sentence you've just put together there. Did you want to start with anyone in particular, or we're going to just go in order?
Yeah, I mean, that was what I meant by the summary. Is it like, that's essentially my summary, that I disagree with those arguments against it. And I'd love to have someone, we might organize this in the future when we have our first guests on, to have someone who doesn't like BMI, who's obviously intelligent, intellectual, that thinks about this sort of stuff, and have an honest debate with them about why they don't like it, because I'm sure they'll come up with some amazing points and put it in a way that would be quite convincing. I think that's absolutely. Let's go ahead, Matt. Let's go through all those points that I just spoke about as to the arguments against BMI, and let's put our arguments back, the counter arguments to that, to sort of say why we actually think, it's a good point, but how realistic is it in the real world? And I think that can be best started off with the whole muscle mass thing. Do you want to take it away? Do you know where I'm going with this one, or?
I think I tend to know where you're heading with this one. So BMI overall is just a measure of total weight and your height. It doesn't factor in specific body composition. And when Max mentions that, okay, we're factoring in bodybuilders and high performance athletes and things along those nature, when you start to accrue muscle mass that is above the standard norm, you tend to increase your total weight and thus your BMI, because muscle mass is density wise more dense and weighs more than the same density or volume of fat mass or water mass or something similar. I think it's pretty similar to water, but fat mass in adipose tissue tends to be a little less dense. Hence, we tend to weigh a little bit more without the appearance of, let's say, someone who would be generically classed as a higher BMI. Max, am I correct in that statement?
Yeah, so just a little quick wording. You accidentally said weighs more. Obviously, it doesn't weigh more. Matt knows it doesn't weigh fat. Muscle doesn't weigh more than fat. As like many people like to say, what weighs more, a kilo of feathers or a kilo of stones? Everyone knows that they weigh the same. So what he means
is... A kilo of feathers?
he very quickly corrects himself, and that's more dense. It's more densely packed. And that's absolutely true.
Weighs more for the same given volume.
Correct. Yeah, 100%. So 100%. So from the 2 points I have against that is that absolutely correct in that people with high that can be off for people that have a lot of muscle. The two things against that is, one, what proportion, and I don't have an answer to this. This is just a genuine question. What proportion of the population are actually fit into that obese or overweight category that have a lot of muscle on their body? My bet is it's a very small percentage. It'd probably be less than 1%, I would say. So I think to discount a whole system on the basis that it isn't applicable for less than 1% of the population, personally, I don't think that's a valid argument or something that you can actually use to push forward as to why something isn't good. No system is going to be applicable for everyone, and it's just a matter of to what percentage do we think makes it invalidates it, essentially. So, for example, if there was a system that didn't work for 20% of people, let's say, that could probably be a fair argument to say, okay, that doesn't work. But for BMI, considering it isn't going to be applicable for less than 1% of the population, I'd say it still makes it absolutely fine. Do you agree with that, Matt?
I tend to lean on your side in this one. On my opinion, in the first place, way before I really had this discussion with you, was that, well, why wouldn't we just assess everyone individually, which we inherently do. But if I'm looking at a piece of paper and I only see a couple of things that your GP has sent me or a couple of things in a case study and I see a BMI of 27, I'm going to assume, and this is my using assumptions, I haven't spoken to the person, don't know anything about the person, haven't seen any photos or done any physical assessments, I'm going to assume that the adipose tissue distribution is going to be higher than the amount of muscle mass that they have. So for a little bit of context, Max, I weigh about 70 kilos ish at the moment. I haven't weighed myself in a hot minute, but I probably weigh around that. I'm about 1.73 meters tall. Don't know what that is in freedom units. Feel free to go search it up. I'm pretty sure it's about the height of Mario from what I'm aware.
I think it's half a bald eagle, pretty sure.
It sounds about right. About 13 Glocks from my memory. So my BMI is 23.38, which puts me at close to the upper end of the healthy weight range. 25 is when we generally consider someone to be overweight, which is generally not as advantageous for their health outcomes. I have been heavier in the past when I had a little bit more fat mass on me, when I was a little bit more muscular, close to really hitting that 25 BMI and over. But if you looked at my appearance and my blood work, you would assume, and given I'm very aware that blood work is a very temporary, short period of time, we're not looking at the long-term effects of blood work. If you looked at myself overall, you would not assume that I would be a BMI of 25. You would be, okay, you're probably within the healthy weight range. Well, Max, not everyone has laser eyes like you.
Oh, okay. Well, I think people aren't assuming, I see your point. I think people just tend to underassume BMI. People who don't know what BMI they're actually looking at when they're looking for BMI, they don't. I'd say the average person probably undershoots BMI by like 5 points.
Yeah, interesting. I think majority of people, including like your early dietitians and early nutritionists, can't assess BMI without having to done like a lot of physical assessments in the first place. So ensuring that we can actually make that assessment is a skill that requires a lot of practice and a lot of repetitive interventions and assessments.
It definitely takes a lot of experience. Absolutely. Yeah, completely agree. So I guess, I think that's although I disagree in that I think you definitely look like your BMI. I think that there'll be probably people that would mistake you for being less than what you actually are. So I guess so my first argument is that that when people say, it doesn't work for all populations, it doesn't work for people that are muscular, I feel like that's pretty much debunked if we can say that we think that probably less than 1% of the population does fit into that category. So there's no real point talking about them anyway. Now you could also make the argument, what about people who are over muscular and over fat? And like, yeah, that's a good point. For example, they do have a mixture of more muscle than the average person and more fat than the average person. And that's a good point too. I just don't think it's many people as well. And I think once you do have a point where you have a lot of fat on your body, probably it's going to be indicative of those negative health outcomes in the long term anyway. So I don't really see the point there. And the final point being that having a lot of tissue on your body, as per se, we've talked about this a lot, Matt, doesn't matter what sort of tissue it is. If your BMI is 30, whether it's muscle or fat tissue, Matt and I aren't high-fiving. Awesome work, man. You're setting yourself up absolute pinnacle of health. You've got 100 kilos of muscle more than what you need to have. That's just not the reality of things. Having a lot of muscle on your body isn't good for your health in general. So it's not something that we go, oh, amazing work. So again, I think although BMI doesn't give you the perfect amount of that, if you're a BMI of 30 and you're muscular, you're definitely a lot healthier than someone who's BMI of 30 and they're fat, but they're still not great compared to someone who's a BMI of 20.
Let's specifically pinpoint what you mean by overmuscular, because I think when we say overmuscular for when we're talking, me and you, I think it's very easy to exactly know what each other are thinking of. If I went to someone on the street and said, "What is overmuscular?" They'll say, I don't know, someone who like works out and goes to the gym and kind of has some good muscle on them. Like, wow, that sounds like a relatively healthy body composition from my perspective, with probably the close to the optimal long-term health outcomes from where I'm sitting. When we're talking about overmuscular, we're talking like upper echelon of bodybuilding, sport performance level of kind of people, then not the kind of people that you would ever see in your daily life, unless you live in, let's say, very close to a high-level body sport gym or something similar. We're talking like very close to, when you look at them, you're questioning, are you on steroids or not? That kind of level of muscularity. And it's not just your simple, he likes to play sports and he likes to keep active. That's not on the same table in this scenario. And in terms of the health outcomes, we're generally referring to the incurrence of high blood pressure and things that stem from that. From my awareness, and Max will tend to agree on this one, the total mass tends to lead towards the high blood pressure and vascular resistance, but the higher mass from adipose tissue alone provides a lot more negative health outcomes that the muscle mass doesn't apply. The muscle mass is quite protective up until a certain point. And that point can vary for a lot of people, but unless you're training 7 days a week with perfect nutrition, perfect supplementation, assuming your nutrition is already perfect, and then nailing sleep, stress, recovery, and of course your training, from my perspective, it's very, very, very difficult to ever even think about getting to that point of overmuscularity.
Man, that was absolutely so well said. I completely agree. And I'm really glad you distinguished that. And that's why I preface it being less than 1%, is because this doesn't happen often. And most people probably couldn't even get there if they wanted to naturally. If they tried really hard, they probably couldn't get there just because their genetics wouldn't allow them to get there. So only a very small percentage of people can get there in the first place. If everyone was trying to do it, only a small percentage of people could get there in the first place. And not everyone's trying to do it, clearly. We've only got a small percentage that are actually trying to do it. So that really dwindles down the amount of people that we will see that are very muscular, that get themselves to a point where they're still at a low body fat percentage, but in very high BMIs. So, 27, 28, 29, 30 plus, whilst doing it naturally. Of course, we're not talking about anyone that takes performance enhancing drugs. Got nothing against them, but that's just not what we're talking about for this podcast, because it'd kind of be a little bit silly to be talking about health and then talking about performance enhancing drugs and just ignoring that concept. So for the point of this podcast, that variable is completely taken out of question.
Yeah, absolutely. Max, if I think off the top of my head, if I go to my gym at any point of the day, I don't think I can think of a single bloke and or gal who is overmuscular. It's just, it doesn't tend to be very common from the kind of gyms that I would normally go to. Have you ever come across those kind of people?
Yeah, so look, obviously it's very rare. I definitely have, for sure. It's obviously very rare though. If anyone was going to, it's going to be me, right? I surrounded myself in it. I surround myself in it 24/7. People who are naturally trying to gain as much muscle as possible, as much muscle as their body will let them. So inherently, for example, me, my BMI got up to over 29 at my heaviest, and that was obviously all done naturally and within a body fat percentage that would be absolutely fine for any human. So that's purely just from muscle. Really, the reason that's it. I think my BMI started potentially under 20. I think, which is obviously super low. So my BMI, I've got basically gone up by almost. I think it was just over 20, but yes, almost 10 points. My BMI has gone up by, and that's all from muscle. So absolutely, I was one of those people that was walking around like that day to day, like that, and it's noticeable. Like you don't, as someone who's been there and done that, it's just take a look at my Instagram. Like the only time you're going to be seeing people like that is if they look like me or a woman that looks extremely muscular. Anyone besides that isn't going to fall into this case scenario, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Max, I've more so been aware recently of the impacts of high level of overmuscularity and the issues in sleep apnea, which I think is extremely interesting and something that we don't really take into consideration. It's kind of like an invisible condition that we don't really acknowledge very often, and I think goes underappreciated in terms of how much of an impact it actually has on our total life expectancy and recoverability.
Yeah, no, you brought up a really good point before about the whole idea of what muscle, what's impacting muscle from a health perspective. You said a really good point about the blood pressure. Also just impacts on just your general heart health overall. It's a lot of extra tissue for your heart to be pumping blood to, and it makes the heart work a lot more and a lot harder. And that can't be ignored. Amazing point about the sleep apnea. Lots and lots of bodybuilders. To be fair, I don't know many natural bodybuilders that have to use, what are they called? The sleep machines?
CPAP machines. They're
CPAP,
commonly referred to, anybody who uses them, as CPAP bros.
So yeah, absolutely, completely agree on that one, in that it's very common. I'm not sure about this statement, but I think it could just be from, because I know with people who are fat, it's just lots of fat around the neck that really impacts things. Is that right?
Well, I think it's a bit of a combination of things. So it's generally any a very high level of mass around that esophageal area, as well as potential for the high level of mass to be potentially reducing the amount that our chest can expand during our night's sleep when we're not pushing as hard, especially if you have difficulties using your lungs and your diaphragm. I think that can be a factor in the scenario. Potentially undermuscularity of the muscles that control the breathing reflex. I'm not going to pretend like I'm a speech pathologist in this instance. I'd love to have a speechy on. They're extremely interesting to talk to and probably a great area to comment on. But from my awareness, it tends to be a few different factors. A lot of it is total mass indicated.
Cool. Yeah. That's very interesting that you say that. I think, you bring up some good points, but we're going to be honest, neither of us know. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, so I guess they're my 2 points against that main argument. The main argument is that BMI was only made, BMI isn't applicable to all people, so it's shit. And I guess the counter argument is that, well, nothing is going to be applicable to all people. BMI probably isn't applicable to BMI probably isn't applicable to less than 1% of the population. I'm more than happy to give you that. But that doesn't mean it's not applicable to the other 99% of the population. The other interesting argument I hear, which is a curious argument, I'm just not sure. For all these things, I just feel like people, they give you their one-liners without actually thinking about it, which I'm not sure whether that's true or not. Because all these arguments I've just thought off of my own head, by the way, so I could be way off. But the second argument is always that BMI was only made for white men. Which, I mean, okay, well, like, that's interesting. Like, let's explore that. Let's just say it's true. I'm not even going to try and debunk that, because I don't think we need to debunk the whole argument as a whole. If it is, that's absolutely fine. We've got our reference ranges for white men, which is 18.5 to 25. It's still a scale. Why don't we just change the scale to white women, black women, Asian women, Polynesian women, all the different people, to have their own brackets? I think the fact that men and women are both 18.5 to 24.9 on the BMI scale could be something that needs to be changed and needs to be updated. Do you agree?
A tricky situation and a complicated answer. So I tend to agree that there probably should be different reference ranges for different populations. I think there are some
for Asian people. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I'm not totally aware of which populations have higher or lower reference ranges, or if they're more strict or expanded. I think there's many factors that go on to determining what reference range would be appropriate for the given population, muscularity being one of the major ones. If the population total has a more active lifestyle, I think that will have a massive influence on the total BMI range that's appropriate.
Yeah.
I haven't really heard the
really
useful for only a single population one yet. Yeah, that's one thing I haven't come across.
Right. Okay. That's so interesting, because that's the one I've probably heard the most out of everything.
Wow.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So for me, I feel like it's just simple in that, like, even if that's true, I haven't even bothered to research whether it's true or not, because I don't care whether it's true or not. Even if it is true, I think that's fine. Obviously, it was definitely a sign of the times of when it was made. I think it was made 100 years ago or whatever it was. Definitely a sign of the times of the way the world worked back then. And I think that's fine. Let's make some reference ranges for women and for different people. We already have done that. So a really good point. We already have done that for Asian people. I'm not sure just Asian men or for Asian women as well, in that it is the reference range is just pushed down a little bit. So the low BMI is a little bit lower, I think 17.5 or so. And the high is also a little bit lower, just because that is, again, this is tailored towards them as a general population. Also got the opposite for Polynesian people in general. Tend to have higher levels of muscularity and higher levels of bone density as well, specifically bone density, which is going to, on average, push them a little bit higher. But I don't think those reference ranges have been changed. But I'm all for, I think we should be changing it for different sexes and ages and races and people.
Sure. I think once we boil down the conversation to the individual populations and the individual people in those populations, I think the usefulness of BMI is less and less, let's say, important in the entire equation. I think if you're coming to see me and I do an assessment with you and we go through a standard dietitian consultation and or nutrition coaching, I'm not going to be asking you generally what your weight is, because I personally don't care. I think by far the biggest impact that I can have with you is working alongside you and supporting you, working collaboratively with you to reach your health and performance goals. Generally, weight is a factor that kind of comes along the way, but I think we need to acknowledge that it does have a factor in our overall health, and it is important to address, but maybe the actions of ourselves doing quote unquote healthy activities is going to lead us to a situation where we're more comfortable, have greater capacity, greater function, and can just achieve more than if we were to focus on a single number, which is weight, which can bring me on to another topic, Max, but I'll let you comment before we move there. Remember to check the link in the description or our website for our consultations. Back to it.
No, yeah, I completely agree. And I'm the same. If I was looking to speak to someone who, the clients that typically are clients who have goals that yours usually do, which is about health and improving, those sorts of markers of wanting to feel better, move more, etc., I'd be exactly the same as you. So completely agree with you on that front. And yeah, I guess it comes down to exactly where do you draw the line. At the moment, I think the line has been drawn too early, in my opinion. I think drawing it at just one for all is just a little bit too early. I'd say like at least change it to male, female. And then if you wanted to do just a base race, like a few different races as well, that would probably be a good idea as well. Just to give you more of an idea, because if you are talking to someone, I think the other thing is that people don't know this as well. People don't know that the Asians are, a little bit down and Polynesians are a little bit up. So that if a Polynesian came into a doctor and they were BMI of 26, for example, I don't know these numbers. I'm just making this up, by the way. The doctor may assume that that person's overweight, but they're actually not. Yeah. So I guess it would be worth exploring that as well to see if it'd be good to potentially make a few more categories. So for me, that's the second argument, and I'll let you go, Matt, is that for sure it's made for white men, but I don't see why that needs to be a negative. I guess it could be a negative in that it doesn't apply now. But like that would be a good point in that, like, for example, if you're a woman and your true range may not be 18.5 to 25, but it might be. Like, I'm sure there's been plenty of research on it.
Yeah. I think it can be a very useful tool if we delve into that area of research that we can have in our arsenal. But I think if we were to go into that scenario, it's just going to be another tool that may have a slight factor in our consultation. It's not going to be the be all end all. Be like, oh, you're a BMI of 0.1 over. That means we don't need to continue the service. I don't think we've understood exactly what our goals in this situation are. And that's potentially another limitation of BMI. It's not necessarily an indicator of total health. It's more so a generalization of if I was to visualize this person internally, what would I generally think of this person from a physiological perspective?
I love all your takes, man. They're so good. Because that's 100% what we think. Matt and I don't give a shit about BMI. We think it's, such a small part of the equation, but it's a matter of how much knowledge do you know about the person at the time. And that's all we care about. If all we know is height and weight, we can get a lot better of an understanding once we get BMI. But if we know the person's body fat percentage, we know what they look like, we know what they're eating, what exercise they're doing, how much they're sleeping, their stress levels, I couldn't give one shit about BMI. Yeah. That's why I've never, anyone that I speak to in person, I've never once asked anyone's BMI or made sure to get their BMI down in any way at all. It's never even crossed my mind because I couldn't care less about it. But on a scale where I don't know anything about a person, that's when, in my opinion, when it's a good tool to get a general understanding. And for sure, as Matt said, you're going to make assumptions, and those assumptions are going to be wrong. But most of the time, for me, in my opinion, they're going to be right. And that's better than nothing.
I guess so. Yeah, I would tend to agree. Yeah. I think moving on to my next kind of little area of interest, I think BMI, and I'm not sure if we've covered this, but BMI stands for Body Mass Index, for anybody who's curious. BMI in general can be a useful tool for that generalization, but again, it's not tailored to the specific person sitting in front of me. And that goes for a large variance of factors. So we've got total water stored in muscle, subcutaneous tissue, visceral tissue, total adipose tissue as a whole, organ mass, bone density. There's a lot that goes into your weight as a whole. It's not just how much you have in terms of adipose tissue or fat mass. That's a very common thing to think. That's the only variable that changes. But in reality, a lot of those things change on a very regular basis, if not daily, if not hourly, especially if we're looking at water. Let's talk about subcutaneous and visceral adipose tissue, Max. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so BMI doesn't tell us a whole lot. It also doesn't tell us the type of fat either. So it really doesn't give us any indication with anything. But in my opinion, that doesn't make it a negative. It just means that if we had better tools available, such as a DEXA, they would have had a DEXA. But they haven't had a DEXA because we don't have those tools available. So yeah, it doesn't even tell us the type of fat. Like there's brown fat, there's a bunch of different types of adipose tissue that we have in our body that is going to also determine health outcomes on a long-term scale. Your specific question, subcutaneous versus visceral fat, really good point as well. Yeah, so we know that visceral fat tends to be more negative at long-term health outcomes in comparison to subcutaneous fat. And BMI gives us no indication of that. That's just a limitation. That, of course, if you have two variables being height and weight in an equation, you're going to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of limitations. It's just what happens.
Absolutely.
For me, I guess I just wouldn't see that as a negative. Just in the sense that, like, it's like if people were like being like, oh, it's an okay example. This is Max's analogy number one. People were like, oh man, you get like medium size shirts for your t-shirts. Like yeah, usually a medium, yeah, probably. Like, oh nah man, like I always tailor every single one of my shirts. Like, man, you're an idiot, bro. Like, why do you? It's like, I don't have access to a tailor. I just go to Kmart and get a shirt. Like, that's just, sorry, man. Like, I'm poor. Like, that's all I can do. It's like, sorry that you're rich and you have a million like access to your own personal tailor who can stitch every stitch for your perfectly shirt that can see every single detail of your body. That's fantastic, but I don't have access to that. And I feel like that's kind of like the same thing of like, it's the worst analogy ever, but
it's not too bad. If we add on to it, it's more of an analogy of, well, why don't we just DEXA scan everyone instead of using a BMI?
Exactly.
Well, it's more of sort of an access and then potential radiation exposure, and then just realistically the price of it. I can measure your BMI in like 0.5 of a second versus getting a DEXA scan, which takes a lot of time and it costs like $500-$600 or something last time I checked. It's just not that repeatable. And we have a full podcast going into DEXA, which I'm pretty sure you just listened to in episode 3. No, episode 3. Beautiful.
You definitely have listened to that. We should call this the DEXA podcast, I think. I did an assignment for university in a second year or something like this. It might have even been first year. It was talking about BMI. And I thought I'd just share it because, I don't know, I just feel like it's interesting and why not? Are you happy to have a little spiel, Matto?
Absolutely. I'd love to come back to subcutaneous versus visceral in a minute.
Oh, yeah, but let's do it. Let's go.
Sure. Okay. So my only couple little quick hot takes on subcutaneous and visceral. So subcutaneous is the total fat mass that we have underneath your skin. So it's generally, when we would think of what fat is, it's probably that kind of fat. We need fat.
That's true. Yeah.
It's essential in our lives. We can't go without it. But there is a certain range of how much we can have on our bodies before it starts to become harmful, both too low and too high. So it's very important that we stick to a specific range that is specific to you, because not everyone is the same. And if you fit into this BMI, a certain range, even if you're within the healthy range, sometimes it may not be beneficial for you as well. Most of the time it is. So that's subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous being below the cutaneous layer of the skin. Visceral fat is around the viscera, the organs of our body. So we've got fat that usually accumulates around the heart, around the liver, pancreas, gallbladder, sometimes intestinal mass as well. It generally causes a few more problems, which I'd love to discuss a little bit later, which is potential for fat infiltration into the actual organs. And I'm not entirely sure if, this is me speculating a lot here, not entirely sure if it's being pushed in or if the total fat mass is just accumulating and it's more inside of the organs itself. And we see that in metabolic associated fatty liver disease, used to be called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We've now changed the wording to be more reflective of what the actual condition is, usually associated with metabolic disorder and total metabolic function being of a higher BMI. Generally, when we gain in BMI, we gain in subcutaneous fat, we also gain in visceral fat. That being said, we don't know for certain unless we go through and do a DEXA scan, or if I'm looking at your liver test reports, you don't drink much alcohol, you don't do much recreational, if any, drugs, and then you have high elevated enzyme liver function tests. I'm going to leave the suspicion that the main cause of that elevation is going to be metabolic associated fatty liver disease without getting further scanning. If it's a potential problem and our interventions don't reduce those numbers, which of course it can be a lot worse, and we can go into metabolic associated fatty liver disease, also MAFLD, I'm just going to refer to it as a MAFLD from now on. if we don't reverse those numbers, it can potentially lead to a further investigation from other areas, but it's more so a confirmation from my perspective of my suspicions of MAFLD. Do you have any thoughts on that one, Max?
Yeah, I guess all I can say, because this really isn't my area, so I really don't know much about it at all. All I can say is that to summarize what you were saying would be that visceral fat equals bad. Visceral fat is really not, it's going to be something that we really, really want to be focused on. And for someone that's trying to stay healthy overall, it's going to be something that's important to minimize. And that's potentially what we can go into in a future podcast, talking about visceral fat and how we could potentially reduce that overall. Because there are ways in that we can, like, you're obviously never going to be able to target specifically visceral fat, but there are good ways that you can hopefully aim to reduce that overall. Obviously, calorie deficit being the main one, but exercise is a really big one as well. And how that might change over the course of a lifespan too. For example, what do we see a lot, Matt, is we see visceral fat, older men. They have those big, pot bellies, big beer bellies, and that's a lot of visceral fat in there, So I guess, how, what's going on from a hormone basis of how can we reduce this, I think could be something interesting that we talk about, because absolutely the fat around your organs is something that's really, really negative and really going to mess around with your health quite significantly.
Absolutely. There's some speculation. I'm not sure if there's confirmation at the moment, but I'm quite curious as to if the impact on type 2 diabetes and inability for our body to function and respond to insulin and all the blood glucose that we intake from food. I'm quite curious to see if that's a response from increased visceral fat around the liver and the pancreas, leading to damage of the pancreatic beta cells, leading to reduction in insulin production, leading to our inability to manage our own blood glucose. It seems like it's very much a cascading of events once we increase that visceral fat. And then if it's not managed in a way that's reaching our goals, both from a health and from a mentality perspective, there's potential for a lot more damage to occur later down the line. In the same sense that our heart starts to create plaques in our early teens. It's not just a thing that happens later on. It's very much the foundation of where you start can very much influence your end position.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Definitely agree that you don't just need to start cracking down on things once you hit 50. That's for sure.
Not to say that you can't. You can absolutely make changes at any age. More so an investment perspective. How much you're going to get is directly correlated with how early you start the intervention.
Yeah, interesting. I think I tend to disagree.
Ooh, finally a disagreement in this little episode. Tell me more, Max.
I think I don't necessarily think that if you start later, someone that starts earlier than you, I don't know. If you have twins, one of them, fucks around a little bit in their 20s, doesn't do much, and then they hit 30, and the other guy, he was stable the whole time, and he lived a pretty healthy lifestyle, I guess you could say. And they both crack down after that, and then from their 30s onwards, they're both fine. I would say, I don't know. I reckon they're both fine. I reckon they're both living a pretty similar life.
Probably going to be pretty similar. I'm thinking more so the difference between starting your 20s and establishing those healthy habits is very important to the longevity of your health habits overall. As we know, habits are extremely ingrained into our daily lives. Changing them is extremely difficult, and that's what we work towards as dietitians and nutrition coaches. We work to managing those habits that potentially aren't working toward your goals and flipping them around, adjusting, making small incremental adjustments that work toward your goals and can reach something that's more productive for where you want to be.
Cool.
The difference between 20 and 30-year-old, I wouldn't say is the hugest. the difference between starting in your 20s versus starting in your 40s. Well, now we're getting into more what I'm generally referring to. It's more of a compounding interest situation.
Yeah.
The earlier you start, the greater the results. But it's not exactly like you're in your 50s and you can't start and achieve similar results to if you started in your 45-ish kind of age bracket. Do you disagree with that one, Max?
Yeah, I think I do a little bit. Yeah.
Interesting.
I don't think the wording of the earlier you start, the greater your results. I think it would be the later you start, the less chance the results are going to have a negative impact. So the earlier you start, the less chance the results are going to have a negative. I know you're saying the same thing basically, but
if I wanted to be more realistic and a little less, a little more grim, then yeah, I would probably word it like that. But I try to have a positive spin on healthcare as much as possible, because it is quite a scary adventure as we're going through it. It's very much a facing of, here's the endpoint that you're probably going to have. How do we delay that? How do we avoid as much stupid and annoying shit that comes along the way as much as possible? That's a very daunting and very emotionally packed statement right there. And I take a large effort to avoid fear mongering from my perspective.
Nice. Good work. I like that. Here's my assignment, people. Here's my assignment. So it's like 100 words or so. It's not that deep. But essentially, we've spoken a lot about, you've heard a lot about me going, I love BMI, and you're probably thinking, if you haven't clicked off, Max loves BMI. Oh my God, it's his favorite thing. It's really not. I really don't like it at all. But I just think there's so much shit about it, and people don't realize the value that it creates from having only two variables. I don't think is there anything else that we get when you get two variables that are the easy as to get, height and weight, that you can give such a good from that you can get such a good understanding. That's my point. BMI only offers a single whole number. This provides no indication of someone's body composition. Understanding the composition of someone is crucial, as it offers greater insight into their disease risk moving forward. Individuals with bone mineral density and/or skeletal muscle tissue may be classified. Individuals with greater bone mineral density and/or skeletal muscle tissue may be classified as overweight or obese on the BMI scale. This excess tissue, however, does not pose as great of a threat to health and chance of disease risk as excessive adipose tissue. Additionally, BMI does not express one's body fat distribution. This has been shown to be a useful indicator of disease risk. Visceral fat around the organs poses much greater risk for disease than subcutaneous fat. Finally, BMI does not express one's physical activity level, another great indicator of disease risk. Those whose diet follows alongside the Australian Dietary Guidelines and are physically active but have higher BMIs are not subject to the increased disease risk that BMI guidelines suggest. So I guess that final point there we didn't even speak about, which is a really interesting point to speak about, is that people who are physically active, low stress, sleeping well, eating in accordance to the Australian Dietary Guidelines, and if they're also someone who happens to have a high BMI, very, very different scenario than someone who has a high BMI who sleeps 1 hour a night, is the CEO of Apple, and in terms of stress, and eats 4 Mars bars every day. Quick ad break, guys. Remember to click the first link in the description to check out our dietitian consultations and services. Back to it. I wanted to say that, what's it called? Like, says it summer roll? That like coconut thing.
Oh, a bounty bar?
I don't know. They have 4 bounty bars every day. That's a very different person. If both of them have a BMI of 30 or a BMI of 28 or whatever, they're two very different people. And you're likely to see very different health outcomes from those people. So I think, it's good. These are things obviously against BMI, and it's good to just be honest about the pros and cons of it overall, and have a chat about that, really.
Sorry, Max, please keep going.
Yeah, no, look, I've got like a few other things to speak about, really. So
before we jump across to that, I'd love to comment on your last point that you made from reading out your assignment. Yeah. So you mentioned that the individuals who stick to the Australian dietary guidelines of healthy eating, in quotation marks, generally don't have the same negative health outcomes as people who are just assessed by BMI alone.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note that it doesn't mean that they're without the risk that increased total body mass applies. It's very much a situation of their risk is reduced, but it's not absent.
Really good point. Yeah, so perfectly well said. Is that it's just a reduced risk, exactly, and it just means that if, I guess the thing, second analogy would probably be like the starting behind the 8 ball thing, in that if your BMI is higher, you're starting behind the 8 ball, and it's hard, and you're never going to be able to be as have as good a health outcomes as someone who is doing everything right at a lower BMI. Would you agree with that? So like if you had two groups of 100 people, one of them was a BMI of 20, one of them was a BMI of 28, and all of them were doing everything perfectly. Sleeping perfect, stress was perfect, nutrition was perfect, training was perfect, exercise was perfect. Would you say just on average the people that are BMI of 28 are going to have more disease risk?
Yeah, I think that generalization is probably appropriate for that situation. And I'd love to speculate with you on theoretical leads and indications because of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess from that we can conclude, if we've got those two populations, and I agree with you, we can conclude. And again, this is all man-eye speculation. There's never been studies in this stuff. This doesn't happen really. So we can conclude from that speculation that, okay, so being a higher BMI does actually result in you being subject to worse health outcomes. But and this comes down to my kind of my hierarchy and my tiers, in that, in my opinion, weight is still very low down the list on things that actually do impact your health. So as I was saying before about the stress, sleep, what you actually are eating, like your diet, the amount of physical exercise you're doing and physical activity, all those 4 things are way, way higher, in my opinion, than just the variable of weight as per se. So I guess, yeah, my point being is that if you have someone who is at a higher BMI, but they're doing everything perfectly from everything else, so they're just at a higher weight, but all those other 4 variables are ticked off. And if you compare to someone who may be of a BMI of 20 but is doing everything wrong, horrible stress, horrible sleep, horrible nutrition, no exercise, potentially the person that a high BMI is actually going to produce better health outcomes than the lighter population.
I would tend to agree. I think that's probably more realistic of a situation. Do I have any evidence to support that? No, not really. I think it's really difficult for a lot of individuals who would have a higher BMI to be sticking with those, let's say, general healthy practices. We're more likely to see people who engage in those practices that we know are massively beneficial to your health. They're more likely to be of a lower BMI.
I think overall I can agree. The only thing I would disagree with would be that I'd say there's still a lot of people at a very high BMI who are decently physically active. I think that's probably the one of the variables. Stress as well. Probably stress is going to be roughly the same. Doesn't really matter what your weight is. Your stress levels are going to be indicative of other things going on in your life, family, job, which are going to be the same. Doesn't really matter what your weight is. People are going to have stressful jobs. Doesn't matter whether they're obese or not. And people are going to have crazy families. Doesn't matter whether they're obese or not. So those 2 variables probably don't really are going to be different between the populations. I think exercise as well. I'm not sure, just from what I've seen in my gut instinct, is that people who are overweight and obese do tend to exercise quite a lot. And they may even actually, you could make the argument, Matt, that they may even actually exercise more, just because there is that stigma, and people are extremely judgy about weight, and they may feel extra external pressure to exercise that people within a healthy weight range don't.
Yeah, that's interesting. I completely disagree.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I think that the stigma against people who are living in bigger bodies in general would influence them to avoid situations that puts them in public situations where they can be judged. One of the biggest parts of that area in our society being gyms.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, all my experience and all the people in my life who are more who are definitely overweight, they always seem to, not to me directly, but I always seem to hear them talking about how they're exercising a lot and how they're doing a lot of things and it definitely is secondary to and on a background of the fact that they feel judged, and they whether there actually is any judgment or not is another question, but they feel judged, and they feel they're so judged probably like on a societal level, to be honest. And they're always talking about it. So I feel like I get the inkling that, wow, it feels like these people are exercising a lot. And it's not like they're lying or anything. Of course they're doing it. So I guess, in my opinion, I would say they're exercising more just from what I've experienced. Doesn't necessarily mean they're exercising at a gym, but it does seem like the people in my life are always doing. They're always doing a lot. They're always doing something. They're always walking or going to some class or doing some new routine or something like that. So I guess, yeah. But you tend to disagree, Matt?
Yeah, I think our potential of exposure in terms of the people that we are talking to can be a little bit more varied. Yeah. I think from everyone's perspective, everyone thinks that the people around them is a generalization of what the actual population is like. I'm not entirely sure. I can be proven wrong, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. But from my perspective, I see that with judgment from any kind of situation generally leads to either seclusion or leaning towards certain societal groups that will make you feel welcome and not uncomfortable, whether that's a positive thing or a negative thing.
Yeah, no, I get your point. Yeah. So we've gone on the biggest tangent, and I really am sad about this because your initial point was amazing. You had a really, really good first point in that. And I was just kind of trying to break it down. So I feel like stress is the same amongst populations. Sleep is probably going to be the same amongst populations. I'd say exercise is going to be roughly similar. There and thereabouts. Would you agree it's going to be roughly similar, there and thereabouts, between people who are overweight and obese versus people within a healthy weight range?
Can of worms. I'm going to lead towards most likely not, but I'm happy to see evidence that would point me in a different direction.
Sure. Man, that is a can of worms, because I think what you're implying as well is if you are saying it, you're saying that because are you saying that's like the only variable, like the main variable as to why they're exercising less?
No, absolutely not. I think there's so many variables that can go into the situation for why you would exercise less. Time constraints and general stress management techniques tend to be one of the larger factors from my perspective. Yeah. But it seems that total exercise may be a large area, or specifically type of exercise as well, where it can be a great area of adjustment into leaning towards something that is working towards our goals.
Yeah, cool. Well, unfortunately, yeah. Okay. I've briefly forgotten your point. So, but essentially, if you can pick up where I'm coming from and interrupt me, but pretty much you were saying something along the lines of that between people who are, because we're comparing someone who is within a healthy weight range. And when we say within a healthy weight range, by the way, we always just mean 18.5 to 24.9. That's just the definition of it. So we're just going to use the definition. We don't actually mean what we're saying. It's just the definition of it. Same as overweight and obese. That's just what the definition is. So that's all we're just an easy way to get across what we're trying to say.
For the sake of the conversation, yeah.
Exactly, for the sake of the conversation, exactly. So when we're comparing someone at like a BMI of 20 versus who's doing everything wrong versus a BMI of 28 who's doing everything right, we both agreed that that person was going to be, the BMI of 28 was probably going to have better health outcomes overall. And what I was trying to break down was that I don't even know what I was trying to break down.
I'd like to comment on that a little bit further, because I think my point, I just thought of maybe a potential where they're having a misunderstanding. From my view, I'm also referring to people who are above a BMI of 30 having that, let's say, additional sense of judgment. I think for a majority of people from BMI of 25 to 30, I don't think there's the same societal judgment that applies, considering, let's say, majority of society is around that 25 to 30 at this point in time. It's more so when you start getting into the additional stages of that BMI scale, then I think the amplification of societal judgment occurs at a rate that's much higher than if you were to be within 18.5 to that 30 range.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I'm glad you actually identified that. It's a really good point, because I completely agree with you now. And all the people in my life do tend to be in that 25 to 30 range. There are a couple of people that are over that I associate with on a decent regular basis, and I 100% agree with your point that they do feel judged. Those people that are well above 30 do feel judged. Yeah. So, yeah, really good point. Really good point to distinguish. Let me quickly pull up, because I wrote a few notes, so I just want to make sure I don't forget anything. So one thing I just really want to quickly touch on is exploring why people want to hate on BMI. I'm more than happy for you to comment on this, Matt. In my opinion, the reason why people like to hate on BMI, and especially people new to the field and in the new, like this, essentially the dietitians of the future, really, I think it's just because it's a trendy thing to do. Really, I think it is trendy. I think it shows that it's like a kind of like a tick. It's like, if you've reached you're going up the ladder of becoming a dietitian, you learn what a calorie is, you learn what a macro is, you learn what a DEXA scan is. You learn, I don't know what else you learn. We learn
you learn how to manage certain diseases, then you learn
exactly,
which style of dietitian consultation you prefer. You probably lean towards, if you had a dietitian education in the last, let's say, 5 or so years, probably leaning towards more of the weight inclusive, more of style, rather than the weight centric, which is a whole nother conversation to have a topic about.
Definitely. And then a part of that, it's almost like you get your little badge. Like, do you hate BMI? Tick. Yes. You've achieved your, let's move you to the next step kind of thing. Because that's just what is kind of the thing to do. So that's why it's popular in my opinion. Do you I know that's obviously, I've drawn so many long bows there, but is that your gut feeling as well with it all, Matt? It's kind of trendy thing to do. You're cool if you do that.
I tend to think so. I also think that generally, from my perspective, a lot of dietitians that I've had contact with tend to follow what the general guidelines and or consensus of literature is, despite not having investigated it further, probably due to our own time limitations and constraints. I tend to think that going along with the standardized norm of nutrition care, medical nutrition therapy, is most likely going to produce the best outcome for the generalized approach and your general person. When we start to break it down and work on that individual basis, I'm having a conversation with Max. I'm not having a conversation with someone who has a BMI of 27, weighs X amount, has this condition, and needs to eat more vegetables. That's not who I'm talking to. I'm talking to Max. He's a living, breathing person. He has stress. He has concerns. He has goals. He walks down the street whenever he wants to, and he likes to play with his dog. There's a lot of factors that go into this scenario, and whether, let's say, BMI would apply or would not apply is a situation which should be determined upon speaking to the individual. And I think that when we're going through as a society, and a medical society, BMI tends to be put on this pedestal as, it's a super outdated, super shit measurement that doesn't actually provide us any good information. Yeah, of course, when you're looking at it from determining your entire health outcomes for the next 40 years, yeah, of course it's not going to provide you much good in terms of the specific health outcomes to, I don't know, let's say a very specific disease or something along those lines. It's very much a situation of, it can provide a generalized approach and a generalized idea of what situation we're going into, which can provide us a little bit of context of how the consultation might go. Doesn't mean that we're going to go that way. Absolutely not. That is ridiculous. I've never heard something containing more poppycock.
Yeah, that is so well said. I completely agree. BMI is only really applicable when you're looking at the timeline. Yeah. So when you're looking at the timeline of everything, of knowing a person, you're at the start. If you don't know them at all, then you might learn a little bit of information about them. You might get some information from their doctor or from someone. You might know their height and their weight. You might know one other key variable, maybe their name if you're lucky. And then that's all you know. So all you've got to work with is those few variables. And the point being is that once we have those key variables, then we can get a whole bunch more information out of those two variables that provides us with a bit more detail and a bit more knowledge. So we can make some ideas of, before we head in to see that person, of, okay, I know it's supposed to BMI of 28, 29. I know what kind of ballpark I'm thinking, what sort of things I'm thinking about moving forward. Yeah, it just gives you an indication. It gives you more understanding rather than leaving you completely in the dark. And then, as Matt was saying, as soon as you open that door and you can see what they look like, with how you can see their face, their emotions, everything Matt was saying before, you can see them as an individual. BMI is the last thing you're thinking about. Yeah, so it's only good for very specific scenarios on things like population scales. So like when we're doing studies and things like that, it's a good tool, because it's super easy to do. You can get thousands of people's height and weight in a matter of seconds. Whereas, how long is it going to take you to write 1,000 people's stress levels, and you got to write every single detail about their life? Is just not appropriate. So, completely love what you said, man. That was really, really such a good summary to finish off. I wish we said that at the start.
Well, I think that's probably the entire reason that I was holding that out the entire way. Gotta spice it up a little bit at the end, a little reward for those loyal listeners. Keep in mind, I'm going to be doing that for the rest of the podcast forever, so you have to listen to the entire thing, otherwise you're not going to get the spicy bit at the end.
Well, I have got nothing else to say. Look, there's obviously lots of things we missed. Matt and I, we're not comprehensive, we're not robots, we don't remember everything. We've probably written a million other notes that we have not spoken about, but that's the reality of listening to a podcast with two humans. We will be doing AI podcasts one day. Not today.
One day we will be replaced by our AI overlords, and you'll never know. It will just be very similar to Max and Matt, just slightly off.
Just a little bit less
smile's
mistakes.
A little bit too symmetrical, or the eyes blink at the same time instead of one individually.
Yeah. A little bit less mistakes too. All right. Well, thanks for listening. I think let's all organize them out. Let's organize maybe for in the first few guests, we're going to get a person who disagrees with us on these points, and we just have some back and forth, just have a discussion around ideas and things along those lines as to BMI, because we could be way off.
Absolutely. And that's one of the beautiful things about what I consider to be evidence-based, is that I absolutely love to be proven wrong. And if you can poke holes in my logic, it makes my day. I thrive off of it. It's one of the reasons why I love conversations with you so much, because you challenge me into confirming and really making sure that I am correct in my judgment and my assessment of the entire situation, but also being aware that I can change my opinion if the relevant evidence is applied.
Completely agree. Got anything else to say?
Let's roll the outro.
Thank you. See you guys.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Real Health and Nutrition podcast. The sponsor of today's show is you. You support the show by listening and using our services of dietitian consultations and performance coaching. We offer in-depth one-on-one consultations to help you achieve your health and performance goals. Any random bloke online can give you a generic meal plan, where we here at Real work collaboratively with you to reach your goals, making you feel heard and including you in your journey's planning. Our service offers tailored advice and can accompany meal plans and/or realistic nutrition strategies, which can be booked via our website, www.recoveryexerciseandlifestyle.com. That's www.recoveryexerciseandlifestyle.com. Just a quick disclaimer, this podcast is for education, information, and general entertainment purposes only, and does not constitute the practice of medical nutrition therapy or healthcare of any discipline. The content discussed in this podcast is not intended to be a substitute of professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please review our terms of use via our website. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.